plan is to completely shut down this Ford plant, the Louisville assembly plant over by the airport, for more than 8 months.
And a late developing story here today. Another shutdown is planned for the Louisville Ford plant down by the airport, this time the assembly plant.
After President Trump announced 25% tariffs are coming on all cars and car parts shipped to the U.S.
Assembly lines that built America are being systematically slaughtered from the inside out. Ford's industrial massacre isn't competition, it's domestic terrorism caused by trade policies functioning as weapons of mass destruction. Witness the carnage. Chicago transformed from productivity to haunting silence. Michigan bleeding money while politicians celebrate victories. Workers becoming refugees, victims of economic warfare waged by those who promised to protect them. $1.5 billion worth of damage is being done on purpose. Now, how does protection require destruction? Why are American policies functioning like foreign sabotage? And when will this massacre reach you? This isn't just about lost jobs, it's about a broken system. And we're about to show you who's behind it, how deep it goes, and what's really at stake. The mathematics of destruction, the mathematics of survival had shifted overnight. Every component, every wire harness, every electronic module imported from Mexico now carried a 25% penalty. Cars assembled in Canada faced border taxes that made them uncompetitive. Chinese manufactured parts, from batteries to computer chips, carried duties reaching 30%. The integrated supply chain that took decades to optimize was being systematically destroyed by policymakers who had never set foot on a factory floor. Ford's response revealed the desperation spreading through corporate boardrooms across America. Emergency pricing changes hit consumers immediately. The Mustang Mach-E, Maverick, and Bronco Sport, all manufactured in Mexico, saw price increases approaching $2,000 practically overnight. The company hoped to offset tariff costs by passing them directly to buyers. But even this drastic measure couldn't stem the financial hemorrhaging. The shock came fast for customers discovering their dream vehicles had suddenly become unaffordable. Dealerships found themselves explaining price increases they hadn't anticipated to families who had saved months for down payments. The American dream of car ownership was becoming a casualty of American trade policy. Ford tried to hold the line through desperate measures. The Lincoln Nautilus, imported from China, became too expensive to compete effectively in American showrooms. The company completely halted exports to China, losing access to one of the world's largest automotive markets and abandoning relationships built over decades. Trade war was no longer theory, it was policy, and it was destroying American business. The industrial earthquake spreads. The shutdown didn't end with Ford's announcement. Across the Midwest, ripple effects exploded through every corner of the automotive ecosystem. General Motors scrambled to revise production schedules, laying off hundreds of workers while quietly shifting truck assembly operations back to Indiana. The company's Fort Wayne facility added shift and hired 200 workers in a desperate attempt to build more vehicles on American soil, avoiding the tariff trap entirely. Stellantis, the multinational parent company controlling Chrysler and Dodge brands, made even more dramatic moves. Entire manufacturing plants in Canada and Mexico went idle as the company tried to navigate the new economic reality. The pain didn't stay contained across international borders. It bled directly into Michigan and Indiana, where 900 component plant workers lost their jobs overnight as supply chains collapsed. These weren't just numbers on corporate balance sheets. Each layoff represented a family losing their primary income, a community losing its economic anchor, and a way of life vanishing before their eyes. The domino effect reached every business that depended on automotive workers' paychecks. The local diners where shift workers grabbed coffee, the grocery stores where families shopped, the repair shops that serviced their vehicles. Nissan began canceling American orders for sport utility vehicles manufactured in Mexico. Toyota slowed shipments of popular models as tariff costs made them uncompetitive. Honda raised prices across their product lineup, passing increased costs directly to American consumers, who were already struggling with inflation and economic uncertainty. As the dominoes continued falling across the Midwest, corporate boardrooms from Detroit to Washington faced a chilling realization. The policies designed to save American manufacturing might be the very thing destroying it. Look, we didn't just report the layoffs. We uncovered the reason behind the robots replacing humans. Now you know why Made in America is losing its meaning. If that opened your eyes, tap subscribe. It keeps us going. Corporate desperation meets political indifference. Ford's executives, working behind closed doors, warned that deeper cuts were inevitable. Tariffs had spiked costs on everything from raw steel to sophisticated electronics. The company that manufactured nearly 4 out of every 5 vehicles on American soil was still losing ground to tariff policies designed to help domestic production. Wall Street watched the unfolding disaster with mounting alarm. Automotive stocks stumbled as investors tried to calculate the long-term damage. Supplier company shares cratered as analysts warned that persistent tariffs could eliminate more than 1 million vehicle sales nationwide within a single year. The financial markets were pricing in a future where American automotive manufacturing couldn't survive American trade policy. Trump's response to Ford's production freeze demonstrated a chilling indifference to the human cost of his policies. When reporters pressed him about factory closures and worker displacement, he dismissed the concerns as expected and doubled down on his approach. They should have brought production back a long time ago, he declared, as if decades of carefully constructed supply chains could be rebuilt overnight through sheer political will. The statement sent shockwaves through every automotive boardroom in America. If the president could casually shrug off Ford's near collapse, no company was safe from similar treatment. The message was unmistakable. Political ideology would trump economic reality, regardless of the consequences for American workers and communities. Jim Farley called the situation the hardest fight in decades, framing the crisis with forced optimism while privately revising financial forecasts downward and slashing guidance to shareholders. With political leaders dismissing the mounting casualties as expected, the warning signs that had been quietly accumulating for months were about to explode into full view. If anyone was brave enough to look, the warning signs nobody wanted to see. The warning signs were everywhere for those willing to look. State governments called emergency meetings as unemployment claims spiked across the industrial Midwest. Indiana labor boards issued warnings about rising joblessness. Michigan city mayors traveled to Washington pleading for tariff relief. But federal policymakers remained unmoved by local economic distress. Cities like Kokomo and Toledo, where automotive manufacturing provided the economic foundation for entire communities, watched their primary employers announce layoffs and production cuts. Workers who had survived previous recessions finally faced unemployment as component production lines shut down and entire shifts disappeared. The North American automotive industry had once been a marvel, a tightly integrated machine spanning 3 countries, thousands of suppliers, and tens of millions of vehicles. That system was fracturing under political pressure that treated complex supply chains as bargaining chips in trade negotiations. Companies couldn't simply move all production to the United States overnight. Their supply chains had been built over decades, optimized for cost and speed. Breaking them apart wasn't just expensive, it was dangerous to the survival of American automotive manufacturing itself. The tariffs were forcing companies to make decisions based on political survival rather than economic efficiency. Through it all, workers found themselves abandoned by the very policies claiming to protect them. The shell game had begun. Jobs added in one location while quietly eliminated elsewhere, creating the illusion of progress while the overall employment picture deteriorated. The political divide was growing as the economic damage spread. Trump insisted the fight was worth the cost. Democrats argued the price was too high. Caught in the middle were workers watching their paychecks shrink and their futures evaporate, asking questions nobody in Washington wanted to answer. The political machinery had set the stage, but the real devastation was only beginning to unfold. American families were about to discover that the cost of this trade war wouldn't be measured in corporate profits. It would be counted in kitchen table conversations about bills they could no longer pay. The consumer shockwave. Following this industrial upheaval, American consumers experienced immediate impact as vehicle affordability crumbled under politically imposed costs. Families planning vehicle purchases found themselves excluded from markets they had participated in across generations. The American dream of car ownership became collateral damage from trade policies designed to strengthen domestic manufacturing. Ford implemented every conceivable desperate measure to preserve sales momentum. The company launched emergency pricing strategies, offering incentives previously unthinkable under normal market conditions. Employee pricing became universally available, fleet discounts expanded to individual buyers, and financing terms stretched to unprecedented lengths. Every strategy pursued one objective: maintaining customer engagement while anticipating political crisis resolution. These strategies failed because underlying economics had been permanently transformed. When a Mustang Mach-E suddenly cost $2,000 more than the previous week, no creative financing could restore affordability for families already battling inflation and economic uncertainty. As families abandoned car lots across America, entire communities built around automotive prosperity began to feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. The economic earthquake was spreading from factory floors to Main Street, communities under siege. The crisis simultaneously devastated factory towns across the industrial Midwest as their economic foundations disintegrated. Cities like Kokomo and Toledo, where automotive manufacturing provided primary middle-class employment sources, witnessed their entire lifestyle threatened by policies purporting to protect American workers. Ripple effects extended well beyond factory gates. Local businesses depending on automotive workers' spending began experiencing economic contraction. Restaurants served fewer customers during shift changes. Retail establishments watched sales decline as families tightened budgets responding to job uncertainty. Service businesses lost clients as disposable income evaporated from communities built around manufacturing employment. Real estate markets in manufacturing communities started reflecting the new economic reality. Home values declined as potential buyers departed the region, seeking employment elsewhere. Local banks reported increased mortgage defaults as families struggled with reduced incomes. But the human cost of these community collapses was about to be overshadowed by an even more cynical reality. The jobs being created were nothing more than an elaborate shell game designed to hide the true scope of the destruction. The shell game of American jobs. Emerging from this community devastation, corporate survival strategies exposed the cynical reality behind political promises regarding job creation. General Motors added shifts at their Fort Wayne truck manufacturing facility, while simultaneously eliminating positions at component plants connected to Mexican production. The company orchestrated a shell game, creating visible jobs in one location while quietly removing positions elsewhere. This pattern repeated throughout the industry as companies struggled adapting to sudden policy changes. Stellantis idled sport utility vehicle production in Mexico for an entire month, hoping to avoid tariff penalties. Yet the disruption forced layoffs at 5 American stamping plants, supplying components for those same models. Every attempt to satisfy political demands for domestic production generated new problems elsewhere in the supply chain. The human cost of these corporate maneuvers fell disproportionately on workers lacking control over trade policy decisions. The pattern of hidden job losses was becoming impossible to ignore. But automotive wasn't the only industry caught in the crossfire. Across American manufacturing, the same destructive forces were quietly dismantling decades of industrial progress. The broader industrial crisis. Beyond automotive manufacturing, the crisis was not occurring in isolation, as similar patterns emerged across American manufacturing sectors. Companies dependent on international supply chains faced identical pressures as tariff policies rendered integrated production systems economically unsustainable. The steel industry, supposedly benefiting from protective tariffs, discovered that higher steel prices destroyed demand from automotive manufacturers unable to afford increased costs. Steel companies found themselves selling less material at higher prices to customers, reducing production due to unsustainable cost structures. Electronics manufacturers confronted even more severe challenges as tariffs on Chinese components made American production uncompetitive with international alternatives. As the manufacturing crisis deepened, Wall Street's cold mathematics began delivering a verdict that no amount of political spin could overcome. The numbers didn't lie, and they painted a devastating picture of American industrial decline. Wall Street's verdict. Culminating these industrial challenges, financial markets delivered their assessment of trade policy effectiveness through declining stock prices and reduced investment in American manufacturing. Automotive supplier companies witnessed their share values collapse as investors calculated long-term supply chain disruption impact. Major manufacturers watched market capitalization decline as analysts warned of permanent competitive positioning damage. Pension funds holding automotive industry investments faced significant losses as the crisis deepened. Retirement savings tied to manufacturing sector performance evaporated as companies struggled maintaining profitability under politically imposed handicaps. Middle-class workers, supposedly protected by trade policies, watched retirement security disappear alongside current employment. International investors began questioning American manufacturing stability as political interference in business decisions created unprecedented uncertainty. Capital that might have supported domestic production expansion instead flowed to countries with more predictable policy environments. Analysts warned that damage to American manufacturing competitiveness might prove permanent as companies abandoned integrated production systems, requiring decades to develop. Efficiency advantages that had made American manufacturers globally competitive were being sacrificed for political positioning, producing opposite intended effects. The financial markets had spoken, but the political machine showed no signs of backing down. Instead, the collision between campaign promises and corporate reality was about to expose just how disconnected Washington had become from the communities it claimed to protect. When campaign promises collide with corporate reality, how does an industry giant fall? One decision at a time. Yet the decision makers were not seated in corporate boardrooms but crafting policy in Washington while remaining willfully ignorant of consequences. The automotive crisis spreading across America revealed the dangerous gap between political rhetoric and economic understanding. Trump's dismissive response to Ford's production freeze demonstrated fundamental misunderstanding of modern manufacturing. His suggestion that companies should have brought production back a long time ago ignored decades of carefully constructed international supply chains that could not be rebuilt through political decree. The complexity of automotive manufacturing, with its thousands of specialized components and precisely timed logistics, meant that sudden policy changes created chaos rather than intended benefits. The president's persistence with tariff policies, even as American workers lost their jobs, revealed the ideological nature of trade policy decisions. Political considerations trumped economic analysis, as administration officials insisted that short-term pain would produce long-term gains. The escalating threats and market panic were symptoms of a deeper crisis, spreading far beyond automotive manufacturing. In agricultural heartland communities, families were discovering that the same policies destroying Detroit were coming for them next. Communities abandoned by their champions. Despite these economic realities, small manufacturing communities that had voted overwhelmingly for politicians promising to protect American jobs found themselves bearing the greatest burden of policy failures. Towns where automotive and agricultural equipment plants provided primary employment watched their economic foundations crumble as companies struggled to survive tariff-induced cost increases. Local officials who had supported trade policies promising to bring manufacturing jobs back to America discovered that political rhetoric could not overcome economic mathematics. Communities that had celebrated promises of industrial revival instead faced plant closures, layoffs, and economic uncertainty as companies made desperate attempts to remain competitive. The disconnect between political promises and economic reality became particularly stark in regions where manufacturing provided the primary source of middle-class employment. The agricultural devastation created a perfect storm, but it was only one piece of a larger catastrophe. The entire concept of North American economic cooperation, built over generations, was being systematically dismantled by political forces that seemed to understand neither its complexity nor its importance. The agricultural crisis deepens, contributing to this community devastation. The crisis in agricultural equipment manufacturing revealed how trade policies were systematically destroying American competitiveness across multiple sectors. Crop prices had collapsed since 2022. Corn down 37%, soybeans down 24%, wheat down 35%. Farmers facing financial pressure could not afford new equipment, regardless of where it was manufactured. China's decision to invest heavily in domestic agricultural production rather than importing American crops created additional pressure on farming communities. The expectation that China would become a reliable market for American agricultural exports proved false as Chinese domestic production expanded dramatically. The combination of falling crop prices, rising equipment costs, and restricted access to international markets created a perfect storm devastating American agriculture. Social service organizations in affected communities reported increased demand for assistance as unemployment spiked and local businesses closed. Food banks, housing assistance programs, and job training centers struggled to meet growing needs as the economic crisis deepened across manufacturing and agricultural regions. The human cost of political miscalculation was measured in broken families, abandoned homes, and shattered communities that had trusted their elected representatives to understand the consequences of policy decisions. As communities watched their economic foundations crumble, the destruction was revealing something even more troubling. America wasn't just losing its competitive edge, it was losing its place in the global economy entirely. Survival mode and the death of integration. The decision did not just reshape an industry, but shattered the entire concept of North American economic integration. The automotive manufacturing system that had evolved over decades, spanning 3 countries and involving thousands of specialized suppliers, was fracturing under political pressure that ignored economic reality. Companies faced an impossible choice: abandon efficient production systems built over generations or watch their businesses collapse under politically imposed cost structures. Ford's announcement that it was reconsidering future product launches revealed how deeply the crisis was affecting long-term strategic planning. General Motors reassigned engineers from expansion projects to crisis management as the company struggled to navigate an increasingly hostile policy environment. Stellantis froze hiring across all operations, while executives tried to calculate the ultimate scope of trade policy damage. The industry had entered survival mode, abandoning growth strategies in favor of damage control. The mathematics of automotive manufacturing had been permanently altered by policy decisions that treated complex international supply chains as political bargaining chips. While American companies retreated into survival mode, international competitors seized the moment. The policies designed to protect American industry were instead handing global leadership to foreign rivals who couldn't believe their good fortune. The global consequences of domestic politics. Simultaneously, international competitors watched American automotive companies struggle with government-imposed handicaps and adjusted their strategies accordingly. Korean manufacturers like Hyundai and Kia gained significant market share as American companies raised prices to offset tariff costs. European brands capitalized on American policy chaos by positioning themselves as more reliable alternatives for consumers, frustrated with domestic market volatility. Chinese automotive companies, previously excluded from American markets through trade barriers, began targeting customers frustrated with reduced choice and higher prices in domestic markets. The irony was inescapable. Policies designed to protect American manufacturers from foreign competition were instead making foreign alternatives more attractive to American consumers. Export markets that had provided crucial revenue streams for American manufacturers began shifting toward competitors from countries with more stable and predictable trade policies. The global retreat was devastating enough, but it was happening at the worst possible moment. Just as the automotive industry faced its greatest technological revolution in a century, American companies found themselves crippled by political policies that made innovation nearly impossible. The technology revolution meets political reality. Compounding these global challenges, the crisis was occurring just as the automotive industry faced its greatest technological transformation in a century. Electric vehicle development, autonomous driving systems, and connected car technologies required massive investments and international cooperation that became increasingly difficult under political pressure to prioritize domestic production over global competitiveness. Ford had invested billions in electric vehicle technology and autonomous driving systems that depended on components and expertise from around the world. The company's Lightning electric pickup truck and Mustang Mach-E required batteries, semiconductors, and software that could not be sourced entirely from American suppliers without compromising performance and dramatically increasing costs. The political demand for domestic production conflicted directly with technological requirements that made international cooperation essential for competitive products. Caught between technological demands and political requirements, companies made desperate choices that satisfied neither. But the most heartbreaking casualties weren't corporate strategies or profit margins. They were the workers whose lives were being destroyed by policies that claimed to protect them. The human cost of political miscalculation. Despite technological challenges and global competition, the most devastating impact fell on workers who had built careers in automotive manufacturing and faced an uncertain future as their industry struggled to survive political interference. The skills and experience that had provided middle-class incomes across generations were becoming less valuable as production systems collapsed under policy pressures. Communities built around manufacturing employment watched their economic foundations erode as companies eliminated jobs rather than expanding them. The promise of trade policies that would bring manufacturing back to America was being fulfilled through the destruction of existing American manufacturing capacity rather than the creation of new opportunities. Families that had supported politicians based on commitments to protect American workers discovered that political rhetoric could not overcome economic reality. The cruel irony was becoming undeniable. In their desperation to survive political pressure, companies were embracing the one solution that would make human workers permanently obsolete. The policies meant to save American jobs were accelerating their replacement by machines. The automation acceleration. Meanwhile, economic pressures created by trade policies were accelerating automation trends that threatened to eliminate manufacturing jobs permanently. Companies facing higher costs for human labor and international components found automation increasingly attractive as a way to reduce dependence on both workers and global supply chains. Ford's investment in autonomous manufacturing systems increased as the company sought ways to reduce production costs without relying on international suppliers or large workforces. Robotic assembly lines that had been planned for gradual implementation were accelerated as companies tried to maintain competitiveness despite policy-imposed handicaps. The irony was devastating. Policies intended to protect American manufacturing jobs were instead encouraging companies to eliminate those jobs through automation. As robots replaced workers and communities emptied, the fundamental question could no longer be avoided. The American manufacturing dream was dying, not from foreign competition or technological change, but from the policies of those who had promised to save it. The reckoning had arrived, and it demanded an answer that no politician wanted to give: the reckoning. Ultimately, the question no employee, no community, and no industry leader wanted to confront had become unavoidable. Was the destruction of American manufacturing competitiveness an acceptable price for political positioning? The workers who had given decades to companies that had provided their livelihoods were asking themselves whether the policies claiming to protect them were actually destroying their futures. The automotive industry's crisis was no longer just about cars, tariffs, or trade policy, but had become a test of whether American democracy could acknowledge and correct policy failures before they caused permanent damage to the communities and workers they claimed to protect. Manufacturing communities across America were learning that campaign promises about industrial revival meant little when the policies designed to fulfill those promises systematically destroyed the economic foundations of their communities. The American dream of manufacturing prosperity was becoming a nightmare of political miscalculation, economic decline, and community abandonment. What do you think? Should American workers keep trusting companies like GM, or has that loyalty been broken for good? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit subscribe if this hit home, and thank you for standing with us today.